Welcome to the Transcend Health Solutions podcast, your go-to source for insightful discussions on ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and all things mental health. Join us as we explore innovative treatments, share expert interviews, and offer practical tips to help you navigate your mental health journey. Tune in and discover how you can transcend the challenges and embrace a healthier, happier life.
All right, welcome back to the podcast. I've got Emily Satil, LBC, on with me today. We're going to talk about something interesting. Total surprise to Emily. I didn't bring up what I wanted to talk about here, so we'll see how this goes. And I have a kind of an interesting format in mind too. So I'm going to propose a topic, and I'm going to tell you how we're going to talk about it. So the broad topic that I want to talk about is something that kind of comes up a lot. Something we just kind of navigate often in the mental health realm, which is the concept of diagnosis. So how I want to talk about the concept of diagnosis is a little bit of a pseudo debate. Okay. So one of us has to take a side on whether this is positive, and one of us has to take a side of whether it's negative and defend that position for a little bit of time, regardless of how we feel about this topic. We have to force ourselves to try to argue the side. Okay. Of those two, what would be the hardest for you to defend?
I see defenses on both sides, honestly.
Of course, me too.
I think ultimately, especially in the setting that we work in, diagnostics is really important. So
then I have to force you to take the opposite side.
That's totally fine with me.
So for the sake of this conversation, or at least the first part before we kind of bring in the nuance, I want you to pretend that you feel that diagnostics are problematic in the setting of mental health, that the challenges associated with this entire paradigm of being diagnosed with something exceed the benefits. And then I'll take the position of the opposite. So to start the conversation, I want you to try to make an argument that put yourself in the position of a therapist that feels that this is a pure negative, that we need to move away from ever diagnosing anything. We're going to take that position and see how would you argue it? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would argue that putting a label on someone is like pathologizing and could reinforce views that a lot of clients already have about being broken or being wrong or even unfixable sometimes, especially with certain diagnoses that maybe kind of have a huge stigma associated. There can be more judgment and a feeling of like being isolated from peers in that. You know, the therapeutic relationship is ultimately one of the most important things, and clients can move past some of their stuff, like a lot of the issues that we can run into and the symptoms that we see in the mental health field are related to things like trauma and their life experiences and are kind of just a normal response to adverse experiences as opposed to some kind of pathological process or disorder.
Yeah, because that's kind of oftentimes the conversation that, you know, many of the things that people come to therapy for, you know, are not pathological. It's part of the human experience, and that doesn't discredit that it's an extreme struggle and that someone needs help and support through that, but it's not pathological to be thinking or feeling the way that sometimes people do when they, you know, come to a therapist. So there's that view, and we'll get to the nuance eventually, but to do the debate, well, I would argue in this situation that you can be shooting in the dark clinically when you don't have a clue what somebody's actually dealing with. They might be dealing with some things that are within the realm of the human condition, and they can be dealing with something that isn't within the realm of the human condition, that they actually are having processes that aren't, quote, normal, that they might actually feel entirely different than the rest of the general population around a very specific topic, or have visceral sensations around this thing that actually most people don't, such as in the setting of maybe OCD. That, you know, somebody might not actually be experiencing it exactly as everybody else's, you know, consensus reality, and that to tell someone that what you're experiencing is actually completely human normal and something that, you know, we'll navigate together, sometimes can be pretty gaslighting towards what somebody's true experience actually is, when they're telling you directly, what I'm experiencing is not normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can't just agree with me. You gotta
I
fight
mean,
back.
in a lot of ways, I do agree with you. Also, I think that there is a way of looking at it as like something can be maybe outside of the norm without necessarily having to be disordered. Like someone can be stuck in challenging thought processes without us needing to kind of put a label on it of, you know, especially with something like OCD, that is something that, you know, generally is going to be a lifelong struggle. And so there can be a feeling of just like, I'm never going to be able to move past this. Yeah, it's kind of challenging to take a hard stance against diagnostics for me in this one, because I'm gonna
go into
not
the
argue.
nuance though. Have you seen it where, what has been your experience with actually realizing that somebody has maybe a very specific diagnosis and talking to them about that, it being helpful, hurtful to the process, rapport building, or rapport damaging? Like, what has this been like for you?
Yeah. So a few thoughts come up for me. Sometimes it ultimately, like initially, causes some type of rupture in rapport, especially if it's a diagnosis that, again, comes with a stigma. Bipolarity, personality disorders, where someone might actually be pretty upset and pretty adamant that I'm wrong. Which, you know, it's not a perfect science, so I can't claim with any 100% certainty to know, but I can look at a pattern of symptoms and the trajectory over someone's lifetime and have a pretty decent hypothesis. Yeah, sometimes people are not ready to accept that diagnosis and have some type of belief around that meaning something about who they are as a person, instead of just being a person living with whatever disorder. I have also worked with clients who at first were hesitant to accept a diagnosis, and then started getting treatment for that diagnosis, say mood stabilizers, something like that, and it completely changed their life, to where before we even start ketamine therapy, they are already making huge improvements. Everything in their life is becoming more stable. And so it becomes something that information then gives them power to know how to plan for a life where sometimes I am going to have to deal with these symptoms. And now also something else that I'm seeing with clients, which is not something that I experienced as much with like older generations, but especially with younger generations, some people seem more willing to accept diagnoses and also to want more challenge, like some of the typically like considered bad diagnoses, which is interesting. There's maybe a feeling of I'm not being taken seriously, or I feel invalidated in how much I've been struggling if I'm not given a label that is seen as, you know, one of the worst. There's this kind of perception, I guess, from social media, that certain disorders like borderline personality disorder, for example, shows like, hey, you've been through a lot of trauma, and that has then led to these symptoms that I think sometimes people I'm now seeing, where people feel almost validated and want to get that diagnosis, which is newer. So again, there's different ways that people might react to that, and in those cases, sometimes it's even more challenging to kind of interrupt that and say, actually, I don't think that that's what we're seeing here. Your symptoms don't fit that. Like your trauma is still valid, and your symptoms are not kind of to the point of anything apart from like complex PTSD or just you're having a normal response to trauma, and you're having a PTSD reaction or acute response to trauma, but not necessarily something that that crosses into that territory of being personality disordered.
All right, we're going to switch roles soon.
Yeah, we are.
But what things, let's go over the TikTok diagnosis. Okay. What things do you see people coming in saying, I have this, and then you actually have interactions with them and you're like, you know?
Yeah. Most commonly, borderline personality disorder. I've actually had a couple of clients think that they have narcissistic personality disorder. And then the most common would be autism and or ADHD. Oftentimes they're actually not incorrect about that, but sometimes there is kind of a misunderstanding of neurodivergence and equating some pretty normal like experiences with something that suggests an autism spectrum diagnosis. So those would be absolutely the most common, especially BPD and autism.
And then what things do you feel like are kind of the opposite, right? So the ones that we actually struggle with, where we see we see the true symptoms of something, and then we regularly are like actually having a hard time to disclose that, because it's a hard diagnosis to accept, or there's so much stigma around. Which ones do you struggle with the most?
By far, number one is bipolar disorder, anywhere on that spectrum. I think some of that is because it generally means that you have to take medications probably for the rest of your life. And a lot of people have this idea that if they can't move through their mental health issues kind of just naturally, that means there's something kind of inherently broken or wrong about them, or they just would prefer to not be on medications, or there's a stigma associated with it, or oftentimes, bipolarity is genetic. There's a genetic component to it, at least, where some people will have a family member who has had really severe like manic episodes where their symptoms can be really intense, and that can kind of create a model for what that looks like, and then people will say, I clearly don't have that because it looks nothing like that. And so that can get in the way of recognizing that this is much more nuanced. And for some people, bipolarity looks like really stubborn depression that's sometimes interrupted by periods of like more irritability and behaviors that almost seem pretty normal. Maybe like a little bit faster speech, sleep might not be very good in those phases when they're hypomanic. And the main thing is like their depressive symptoms can't really be adequately addressed without treating it as if it's bipolar disorder, because there is bipolarity there. It's not unipolar depression, and the treatment is different. And so because the hypomania isn't as severe and isn't causing problems for them, that can be harder to accept. And then some people want a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. I definitely get more clients coming in saying, hey, I'm pretty sure I have this, than I think, especially again with younger generations. Also, that one can be really hard for a lot of clients to accept as well. For the clients that don't come in kind of asking if that is their diagnosis, but the ones that maybe have a lot of trauma and are worried about what that means for their ability to live a normal life or form friendships or things like that.
My nuanced stance would be that there's some complexity here, that we're saying diagnosis is a binary, is either good or bad, right? And I think the nuanced position here is that there are some conditions in which if you don't receive a diagnosis for them, you probably won't receive adequate treatment and then therefore see, much change. There are some conditions where it may not be important to ever really know if that symptom cluster, has a name in the DSM in the grand scheme of recovering from it, seeing improvements or otherwise. And that individually to a patient, there are some patients that will receive a diagnosis and say, I knew something was going on, and this actually empowers me to take, take this and do something about it.
Yeah.
And it accelerates their progress to actually know exactly what they're dealing with, to receive the exact type of therapy that they need for it, the exact types of medications that they need for it, and that they get better. And there are some people that they receive a diagnosis and they leave therapy and they stop their meds because they are collapsed by the idea that they have something that fundamentally might need, something different than, that this is more inborn or organic or something else. And there's also some people who, feel good to know that they were fundamentally born with this. That actually this is more largely a matter of just the selection of genes that they got, and that acceptance comes quicker and moves them faster towards actually taking action against some of these things, and feel encouraged to do so. So I think that who the person is and what the diagnosis is really weighs in, but I definitely think that we're seeing a mix of overdiagnosis of some conditions due to social media, of what are, hey, you don't have social anxiety. I'm not saying that's not a thing. There are people who can be completely paralyzing situations, where, really need, some help and support around this. And then there's also people who are just like, I've got some general normal challenges that I need to work on here. That is a little uncomfortable, but I could move through it. And it doesn't necessarily help to just put up this wall where now, like that whole teleological perspective, that it's not just going, it's just not going to help somebody to actually now start pathologizing this fairly normal human experience, particularly in kind of adolescence and otherwise. So I feel like maybe I summed up my nuanced position there. Is there any nuance to your position you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, my position, I would say, is incredibly nuanced. I think, so the reason that I feel like diagnostics is particularly important in this setting is because we work with people who are treatment resistant. Oftentimes people are treatment resistant because they just haven't, like a therapist hasn't been using a roadmap of, oh, this is what's actually happening here. This isn't just generalized anxiety. This is actually obsessive compulsive disorder. And me validating and kind of just focusing on therapeutic rapport is not going to help this client. In fact, some strategies may actually make their obsessive compulsive symptoms worse. Or if someone is having like some pretty significant like bipolarity and they haven't ever tried mood stabilizers, like that, again, I've had many clients where that's changed their lives, and things that they thought that they were never going to be able to move past, things that they'd been working on in therapy for years, just with medication, they were able to resolve a lot of those things. Also, I think, overdiagnosis is a problem. I think oftentimes there is just like some validity to what I was saying earlier about adverse experiences or traumas or things that were modeled for someone in their household, just kind of creating certain patterns, and those patterns don't always equate to something that's necessarily disordered. Like we can be living a normal life and also still have some issues that come up that maybe get in the way of living the life that we want. And I think it's important to have a realistic view about whether or not something actually does rise to like, okay, this is something that is disordered because it's getting in the way of work and forming relationships, and not taking normal responses to stress or to like social situations to mean like, yeah, I have a social anxiety disorder or something.
I think we kind of nailed a little bit of the nuance here. So just to kind of sum this topic, imagining that somebody was in a position where they're listening to this, and maybe they're in a situation where either A, they're struggling to kind of accept a diagnosis, questioning a diagnosis, or just kind of, essentially torn around this situation that is kind of common. Like, how do you oftentimes navigate this with somebody? I mean, they're in a situation, like this where there's a potential for them to have this be a helpful process, but right now they're not in that place. Like, this is mostly just problematic for them. They're mostly just like struggling with, it seems that my therapist, my psychiatrist, my team, I don't know, they're just kind of throwing a label on me and throwing some meds at me, or whatever it may be. Like, I am more than this. I am kind of greater than this, and I don't really trust this scenario. Like, what's
yeah.
what do you typically, how do you approach this one?
I would spend time with my client processing this, making sure that they see that I see them as a human being and more than just a diagnosis, processing what goes into kind of this reaction where, like, that makes it so hard to accept that diagnosis. What are the beliefs that they have about what their life would be like with this diagnosis, or about the way others might react to this diagnosis? What are their judgments about what this diagnosis means for someone? Maybe they've seen extreme examples in the media of someone with this diagnosis that's been like vilified, and so we'll process those things together and hopefully try to come up with a more kind of clear picture of what the diagnosis is and the realistic impacts that it could have on their life, and also the fact that, like, it can be really empowering to have this information. If someone knows that they have bipolar disorder, it can become easier to start finding a way to build insight into when they're becoming manic or hypomanic, which is one of the biggest issues for a lot of the clients that I've worked with, is they won't recognize that they're manic or hypomanic until after the fact. And then it's just kind of the shame spiral of things that they did that felt kind of outside of their control. And so as much as I can, like, trying to help them see that we're on, a team here. This isn't something that is bad. It's one small part of their life, but it doesn't need to define who they are.
That's essentially what like the identity fusion with the condition, right? Isn't very oftentimes helpful. So I think that's actually like the core of what we're oftentimes processing is like, you are a person who struggles with the symptoms of bipolarity and will benefit from this medication.
Right.
Needs to live life a certain way to help reduce those symptoms.
Right.
It's not okay for you to go on big benders or disrupt your circadian rhythm regularly. That's only going to lead to more cycling and needs for greater amounts of medications, and potentially in hospital admissions or wherever it may be. And so the identity fusion component associated with it, of like, despite that being a truth and a reality that's important process, reckon with, ultimately accept, and all of this, that doesn't necessarily make you, you are not bipolar. You are the person that you are, with the rich experience that you have, with your lived experience, and also someone who struggles with these symptoms. And there's a real difference between that. I think you can exist in a place there. And so identity fusion with the condition is a separate challenge than never receiving the actual diagnosis that would lead to the treatment that would be effective for you. And so I think sometimes we struggle to navigate this like really hairy thing to actually give somebody the best possible treatment. The number one reason for treatment resistance is misdiagnosis. So you're just like across the board, it like stands way out in the data. So the data would say that we got to know what somebody's dealing with. Now, is the DSM perfect?
No.
Has it probably miscredited the amount of impact that trauma can have. Pretty certainly. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of issues with diagnostics. There are, and it still is an important part of the work that we do here. But yeah, the identity fusion thing is a huge piece of this that can impact on either end, where someone is not wanting to accept a diagnosis because what that might mean about their identity, or when someone is taking on a diagnosis that doesn't actually fit them. In making that a part of their identity, where it then becomes like it inhibits them from engaging in the world the way that they should, because, or the way that they want to, because there's this feeling of so going back to the example of social anxiety, like there shouldn't be any anxiety here, and so I'm just not even going to try until I fix this thing that's wrong with me. When it's like, there's anxiety there, do the thing, put yourself out there, even if the anxiety is there. It's when that anxiety becomes insurmountable that then turns into something that maybe needs to be addressed more. But sometimes just this idea of that is my condition almost exacerbates things. And so, yeah, I think that there's a balanced view here where over diagnostics is not helpful either. If people can take on a sick role, if they start to identify with a certain diagnosis, where it can almost become self-fulfilling. And also just the other side of that too, of just kind of sometimes there is actually something here that needs to be addressed in a specific way, whether that's a personality disorder, OCD, bipolarity, and it doesn't have to mean anything about who you are, but it does give us the information to know how to treat this and how to move forward, and how to empower you with the information to know how you can start to build your life in a way that doesn't give this condition so much power over your life. So by pretending that it's not there and that it doesn't exist, it's actually giving it power.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, sometimes the challenge of diagnostics is that to be diagnosed with something, you don't necessarily have to have every feature.
Right.
So that's, you know, sometimes the challenge a clinician will face, that actually, you know, this may be a little bit of this, a little bit of this, and so we're seeing more diagnostics move towards spectrums, you know, that you know, they're somewhere on the spectrum of being bipolar here,
right?
Because they're certainly not just, you know, unipolar depressed. There is some
Right.
cycling here, although it's not very extreme.
Right.
It just kind of presents this way, or autism spectrum or otherwise. And so that's what oftentimes happens in medicine and psych in general, is that we, you know, create some categories, then we say it's a spectrum, and then we go back to saying, oh, actually there were some categories along the spectrum that were kind of important,
Right.
and then we make it a spectrum again, and we go back and forth through time. And so right now some things are spectrums and some things are, you know, still kind of in categories, and we're going to see, you know, that just go back and forth through time. But for me, my big perspective working in a treatment-resistant population is just that the big four in regards to these receiving these diagnoses will be critical for someone to actually see improvements are, you know, bipolarity, OCD, ADHD, and then to some degree any form of psychotic spectrum disorder.
Right.
So
for sure.
If you don't know that you're managing one of these, then the treatment that you're receiving will probably not help with or potentially make worse.
Yeah.
You know, bipolarity oftentimes need mood stabilization and very specific lifestyle management techniques, but you probably won't therapy your way out of it.
Right.
With OCD, we need specific type of therapy, and sometimes some medication approaches, but oftentimes is response to ERP. But you often have to take or do exposure therapy over time.
Right.
But that standard psychotherapy sometimes won't greatly impact a more moderate or severe OCD condition. That ADHD very oftentimes doesn't respond to lifestyle treatments alone or therapy alone. Not that those things can't be highly helpful, but very oftentimes medication is needed, and it's a predominantly genetic disorder. And of course with, you know, challenges with actually being less grounded with reality, very oftentimes medications are extremely useful. So, you know, psychotic spectrum disorders, we find that a lot. Now, if I were going to add a fifth, I would say in personality disorders, very oftentimes it can be very challenging to see progress. And I mean, the term personality disorder, I think, is the major challenge here.
Yeah.
But, you know, to to know how to approach these things therapeutically if we are not well aware that somebody actually fits pretty well in a certain category of a personality disorder.
Right.
And so we need specific types of therapy for these things. And so, as an example, with borderline personality disorder, we very well may spend a lot of time in trauma. We very well may be doing a lot of standard psychotherapy things, but with some of the interpersonal concerns, as well as some of the risk for self-harm and chronic suicidality, etc., very oftentimes there's a lot of skills work that is fundamental to see real relief in challenges like this. And so it guides the therapeutic focus to know what is going on in the grand scheme of someone. And obviously nobody is just this one thing. Very oftentimes when someone has one diagnosis, the likelihood that they will have another one is very high. So if someone has OCD, they may have ADHD. If someone has bipolarity, they may have OCD. This is common. This is very always hard to parse through. But when I saw this study that looked at that, where they were just like, the deal is some of these things that actually, they kind of come in clusters sometimes.
Yeah.
So to me, that was good to hear, because sometimes I think people can feel like kind of alphabet soup. They're like, man, I pretty much have like all of the conditions. Like, what's going on here? Like, and well, actually, the situation is that if there's one challenge, there's probably another. And that's kind of oftentimes the way they go, and that doesn't preclude someone from actually getting to a much better spot. And so, anyway, that's the nuance of diagnosis, the good, the bad, the ugly, and I would just encourage that if somebody has been trying the standards things, they've been trying standard medications that you might get prescribed by a primary care physician or a psychiatrist, that you've been going to psychotherapy for some period of time and just haven't progressed, the next step would be to know what we're actually treating. And then from there, we might be able to treat it more effectively, because we can create a treatment plan that we can actually inform a prognosis, that we can get to the point where we're actually impacting the thing at its core. And oftentimes one of the big challenges is trauma, right? Sometimes we have to treat the trauma enough to even be able to see through the cloud of trauma, to be able to know that someone actually is in fact cycling underneath all of this. Or is actually dealing with some ADHD symptoms that are kind of making them sometimes feel like, just to jump, it's sad as hell when someone has really bad ADHD and they internalize so much shame about how hard life is dealing with it unmanaged, and they feel like, because they don't want to go to medication for it, because it can be overdiagnosed in some settings, that they just won't get treated for it. And it's sad to watch when it probably could get better pretty easily with this. They're trying the things. They're working out, they're meditating, they're doing all things, and they're just like, man, I'm doing all this stuff, and I'm not really seeing a lot of progress in this. So those are the big encouragements. If things haven't been responding, it is time to go back to step one and kind of look at this thing. But looking at identity fusion as well along the way, and making sure that upon receiving this diagnosis, this empowers somebody to kind of take this thing and be able to treat it effectively, versus being collapsed by it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Appropriate diagnosis can give someone power back in their life, because it gives you the tools to know how to deal with something. It gives you the tools to know what the steps are, and there's already stuff that exists around this, we have ways of treating these different conditions. It's not like uncharted territories. And so it doesn't need to be like some kind of sentence to just having a miserable life. This is something you've been dealing with for a long time now, and this isn't changing that. It's just giving you the information that you need to take control back in your life, and to know what steps are at least worth trying. I mean, nobody can tell you what you need to do in your life. You're a human being, you have agency and control and power, but it's worth having the information so that you can decide and try out some different treatments and decide how you want to live your life. And again, ultimately, no one can say, well, this is what I think will have the best treatment. Like, you get to decide how you want to live your life. But it's better, I think, to know kind of, to have some answers and know what you're dealing with than to be kind of shooting in the dark and just repeatedly going to therapy and not seeing anything change. And yeah, that can bring kind of its own hopelessness, versus I do think, even though diagnostics can come with a lot of like stigma that you need to work through and things like that, it is an answer. And sometimes the answer is like as simple as just taking one pill will change my life. One pill a day will actually change my life in a huge way. So I think if there's resistance to that, exploring that, because it's one small thing every day that could give you everything that you've been working towards and looking for. And that doesn't mean the therapy piece isn't important, but yeah, it's kind of an uphill battle if we're not like using the tools that we have at our disposal.
Yeah, I mean that's we know that in the grand scheme, medication does best in the setting of supported psychotherapy.
Right.
And so that's driven home from the data.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ever be in a situation where I'm approaching any of these things with medication only.
Yeah, 100%.
And so, and there are some things that just won't fully respond to therapy only.
Right.
And so that's okay. And so, generally speaking, that very nuanced approach towards not only what is either quote normal or not normal in the human condition, pathological or not, then that's very oftentimes how to approach these things when we've been trying stuff and it's not getting better.
Yeah.
Certainly, a lot of things that people come to therapy for. I'm going through a hard time. I just lost a loved one. I just went through a divorce. I started a new job in a new city and I have no friends and I'm really lonely and I'm trying to figure out how to get myself back up again and going. These are not things that need a diagnosis, other than if you're just trying to get it covered by insurance. That's the function of diagnosis in those settings. To receive an adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder. That's, I don't know. It always felt weird to me, but it's one of the more commonly reported things on
It's
charts.
common. It's
So you gotta
a
call
good
it
way
something
of a good way of getting insurance to pay without it does kind of help with the problem of over pathologizing. And it's just okay, they're going through an adjustment and they're having a really hard time like coming to terms with that in a way that now is maybe becoming disordered. But yeah,
and it can, right? Like, if somebody is still grieving a relationship they lost 15 years ago,
right?
Generally speaking, that's probably a disordered process,
right? If
Especially
it's
if
still impacting their life,
days,
right? Right.
Then we can all agree it's time to move on. But so anyway, that must have been a beautiful 3 days. Anyway, all right, so that's all the nuance on diagnosis. Hope that helps somebody out there that is just mulling over the entire concept of they received one, don't want to receive one. I don't know, just kind of this argument in general. So thanks for trying to debate the opposite side for a minute. And anyway, what's your final thought?
Yeah, final thought is, I mean, like Will was saying, if you have been really working on like your mental health for a long time and you're not seeing things budge, and it still feels like it's really getting in the way of your ability to function in life, maybe seeing if there is something diagnostically that is being overlooked. And,
hell yeah, Emily.
Yeah, just making sure that there's not something diagnostically that's being overlooked. And then also, again, if you're having a hard time, if you're in another boat where maybe you've been doing therapy, but you're having a hard time accepting a diagnosis and are really resistant to engaging in a certain type of therapy or taking certain medications because of your resistance to that diagnosis, talking with your therapist about it. If that's not feeling like a safe and comfortable space for you to be evaluating that with your therapist, then that's something to consider too. But ultimately, like, your therapist is the person that you should be able to trust to talk to about these things, even if you disagree with them. And, again, outside of some extreme circumstances, no one can force you to change anything about or take any certain type of treatment approach. So seeing your therapist as someone that is kind of an ally in this and that you can process this with until you feel ready to decide what kind of the next steps for your treatment are.
So my last thought, the terms with diagnosis, I think sometimes are a challenge. I read recently that the original diagnostic term for ADHD, which we used to call it ADD, was minimal brain dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think we need to do is we need to just rebrand. Most of them we need to refresh every like 5 years.
Yeah.
Get rid of the stigma.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't suggest we go back to minimal brain dysfunction.
Yeah, I do think there are ways that we can maybe more appropriately label certain diagnoses to make them a little bit less, I don't know. I mean, there's a huge stigma associated with a lot of them, and I don't know that they're that well captured by the diagnostic terms. Like I think myself and a lot of people with ADHD actually see a lot of like beauty in the way that our brain functions, and I think that can be said of a lot of different kind of just like neurodivergent ways that brains operate, and so I think that would also be like a huge like caveat to add here too, is like, yes, there may be a stigma, it may be hard to accept something, but like there can also be beauty in the fact that your brain maybe works in a different way, and you don't need to try to fight the way that your brain works. So like I have a friend who he was diagnosed with autism, and he said it was like his entire life he'd been trying to kind of, if his brain was a computer, run on Windows, and then he found out that he's just supposed to be using a different like setting. He's supposed to be on Linux, and now that he's like letting himself use his brain the way that it wants to be used, it's just everything is kind of falling into place much more easily for him, and he's met with a lot less resistance, and he's able to kind of build the life that he wants for himself. And I think that's a really good way of putting it, is just we're all really unique. Our brains work in different ways. Finding out kind of like just how does my brain want to exist in this world, and how can I work with that in a way that gives me kind of more peace and the power to create my life the way I want it.
An alternative option would be that we create an island for people with ADHD, and it will run on whatever schedule feels good that day.
that sounds great to me.
There will be no clocks, actually.
Yeah.
Time dilation is the norm. If only, right?
Yeah.
Then
that would be chaotic and messy and fun and a lot of things.
If a billionaire is watching this and wants to finance ADHD Island, I will help to make the blueprints. I've got some ideas.